For over 10,000 years, entire civilizations rose, organized themselves with precision, belief, and long-term planning, and then disappeared so completely that even their names were forgotten. Cities without streets, temples older than farming, capitals that ruled empires yet left no memory, walls rebuilt by conquerors who never questioned why they stood, underground worlds designed not to be seen at all. How did people with no writing create systems this complex, and why did societies this advanced choose to bury, abandon, or erase themselves? If progress is supposed to move forward, why does archaeology keep finding evidence that it moved sideways or backwards? Were these failures or deliberate choices? And what else have we misunderstood about the origins of civilization that history never warned us about? Ephesus. At the western edge of Anatolia, where the Aegean once pressed inland and ships moved easily between sea and stone, the city of Ephesus existed not as a ruin, but as an expectation, a place built with the quiet confidence that the world it served would continue indefinitely, that trade would flow, festivals would return, children would inherit streets already worn smooth by their ancestors, and that the future would arrive on schedule. Even now, as its avenues lie open to the sky, the intrigue of Ephesus emerges not from what remains standing, but from the unsettling mismatch between its ambition and its end, between a city that once operated as one of the most sophisticated urban systems of the ancient Mediterranean, and the silence that eventually overtook it, raising a question that archaeology alone struggles to resolve. How does a city designed for permanence lose the conditions that made it intelligible to those who built it? The physical evidence suggests continuity rather than fragility. Broad marble roads engineered with drainage channels, terraced housing with pressurized water, public latrines flushed by flowing streams, fountains designed not merely to provide water but to choreograph civic life, and monumental architecture arranged with deliberate spatial logic, most famously the Library of Celsus, whose facade concealed not only scrolls but a tomb, embedding memory into daily use, and the Great Theatre, capable of holding tens of thousands, oriented toward both performance and the harbour beyond, binding entertainment, commerce and cosmology into a single civic frame. Ephesus was not a peripheral settlement, but a hinge point between worlds, enriched by its position along trade routes that connected Anatolia to Greece, Rome and the Near East, and anchored by the Temple of Artemis, once among the largest religious structures ever built, rebuilt repeatedly after destruction, each iteration larger than the last, as if scale itself were a form of devotion, signalling a population that understood rebuilding not as recovery, but as obligation. Archaeological layers reveal continuous adaptation, Hellenistic planning overwritten by Roman expansion, pagan sanctuaries repurposed, streets re-levelled, statues replaced, inscriptions updated, suggesting not stagnation but resilience, a city constantly adjusting its surface without abandoning its core logic. Yet, embedded within this evidence of competence lies a contradiction that grows louder the more precisely Ephesus is mapped. Its decline does not align cleanly with conquest, sudden disaster, or singular catastrophe, but instead appears gradual, administrative, environmental, and almost banal, the result of processes too slow to inspire myth, yet too consequential to ignore. The harbour that once sustained Ephesus began to silt, a natural geological process accelerated by deforestation and river management upstream. And as the shoreline retreated, so too did the city's reason for being, forcing costly dredging efforts that continued for centuries, implying an awareness of the threat and a belief that it could be managed indefinitely. Written records attest to earthquakes, plagues, religious transitions and political reorganization, but none alone explain why such a well-funded, well-maintained metropolis ultimately failed to reorient itself, especially when evidence shows continued investment long after warning signs were unmistakable. Streets were still repaired, baths heated, monuments restored, even as maritime access degraded, suggesting that the people of Ephesus did not experience their situation as terminal, but as a temporary imbalance within a system that had always corrected itself before. The contradiction deepens when later Christian significance is considered, as Ephesus became a centre of early ecclesiastical authority, hosting councils and traditions that should have ensured its survival as a spiritual capital even after economic decline. Yet this too faded, leaving behind churches converted, abandoned, or quarried for stone. The failure, then, is not one of intelligence or effort, but of foresight constrained by success. Ephesus had worked for too long, too well, reinforcing assumptions that tomorrow would resemble yesterday closely enough to justify continuity. Speculation fills the space left by this erosion of certainty, with some scholars emphasizing environmental determinism, viewing the silting harbour as the primary agent of collapse, while others point to shifting trade networks under Roman and later Byzantine administration, arguing that power relocated faster than infrastructure could follow. Still others frame Ephesus as a casualty of its own scale, a city whose complexity required constant surplus and coordination, making it uniquely vulnerable to incremental disruptions that smaller settlements could absorb invisibly. More unconventional interpretations linger at the margins, suggesting that Ephesus was not abandoned so much as hollowed out, its symbolic importance outlasting its practical function, transforming it into a stage set maintained for ritual, memory, and authority long after its economic core had migrated elsewhere. In this view, the ruins do not represent sudden loss, but a prolonged afterlife, a city continuing to perform itself, even as the audience thinned. What remains most unsettling is how ordinary this process appears in retrospect, how little drama accompanies the unravelling of something once considered essential, and how few contemporary voices seem to have recognised that they were living through an ending rather than a transition. The final silence of Ephesus does not announce itself with destruction, but with irrelevance, as attention drifts, maintenance lapses, and meaning slowly detaches from place, leaving stone intact but context gone. Today, walking its streets, the impression is not of mystery in the sense of the unknowable, but of proximity to a mindset that assumed endurance as a default condition. A reminder that civilizations rarely perceive their own fragility while it is still negotiable, and that the most unexplained aspect of Ephesus may not be why it fell, but why it seemed, for so long, inconceivable that it ever could. Göbekli Tepe. On a limestone ridge in southeastern Anatolia, long before cities, writing, pottery, or metal, before the idea of history itself had formed, the hill now called Gobekli Tepe was not a ruin, but a destination, a place people deliberately travelled toward with purpose, memory, and expectation, gathering under open skies in a world that had not yet learned to think of itself as permanent. The intrigue of Gobekli Tepe begins with an absence rather than a presence, with the unsettling realization that, according to long-held assumptions about human development, this place should not exist at all, because it was built by communities that were supposed to be incapable of organizing large-scale labor, abstract symbolism, or enduring architectural projects, yet the ground here contradicts those assumptions in stone. Excavations have revealed massive circular enclosures dating to the pre-pottery Neolithic, more than 11,000 years old, each ring defined by towering T-shaped limestone pillars, weighing up to 20 tons, quarried, carved, transported, and erected without metal tools, wheels, domesticated animals, or settled agriculture, and decorated with reliefs of foxes, snakes, vultures, boars, spiders, and abstract symbols whose meanings remain unresolved. These pillars are not crude uprights, but carefully proportioned forms, some bearing stylized arms, hands, belts, and loincloths, suggesting not posts but beings, entities rendered in stone at a scale that dominates the human body, arranged in deliberate orientations that imply choreography rather than shelter. No hearths, no domestic refuse, no evidence of long-term habitation appears within the enclosures, reinforcing the interpretation that Göbekli Tepe was not a village, but a constructed space of gathering, ritual, or cosmological function, maintained over centuries through repeated building phases in which older circles were intentionally buried and new ones raised above them, an act requiring foresight, memory, and collective agreement across generations. The labour implied is immense. Hundreds of people coordinating quarrying, carving, hauling and erection, fed and organised in a landscape where subsistence was still based on hunting and foraging. A social investment so disproportionate to survival needs that it forces a re-evaluation of what motivated early human communities. The contradiction emerges sharply here, because the dominant model of prehistory long insisted that agriculture enabled surplus, surplus enabled hierarchy, and hierarchy enabled monuments. Yet Göbekli Tepe inverts this sequence entirely, presenting monumentality before farming, symbolism before settlement, and collective ideology before economic necessity. Even more confounding, shortly after the site's peak use, the same communities appear to have begun domesticating plants and animals in the surrounding region, leading some researchers to suggest that the social demands created by places like Göbekli Tepe may have driven the invention of agriculture itself, rather than the other way around, implying that belief systems, not calories, reorganized human life. The contradiction deepens with the site's deliberate burial. These enclosures were not destroyed by enemies or abandoned through neglect, but carefully backfilled with tons of rubble, bones and debris, preserving the pillars beneath artificial mounds, an action that required as much coordination as construction and suggests closure rather than collapse. Why would a society invest so much energy into concealing its own monumental past? And what does it mean that this burial coincides with profound changes in subsistence and settlement patterns across the region? Speculation branches outward from this silence, with conventional interpretations framing Gobekli Tepe as a ritual centre used by multiple mobile groups, a neutral ground where seasonal gatherings reinforced shared cosmologies and alliances, while more unconventional theories propose astronomical alignments, shamanic symbolism, or even encoded mythologies marking a cognitive threshold in human consciousness. Some see the animals carved on the pillars as clan totems, others as constellations, still others as mythic narratives, now untranslatable, without the oral traditions that once animated them, revealing how dependent meaning is on continuity rather than material survival. The work of Klaus Schmidt, who first recognized the site's significance, emphasized restraint, repeatedly warning against projecting later religious frameworks backward. Yet even cautious scholarship cannot escape the implication that Göbekli Tepe represents organized belief without priests, architecture without cities, and sacred space without domesticated life. What unsettles most is not the mystery of how it was built, but why? Because nothing in the archaeological record demands such an undertaking for survival, and everything about it suggests a shared internal world powerful enough to mobilize people across landscapes and lifetimes. In the end, Göbekli Tepe resists resolution not because evidence is lacking, but because the assumptions brought to it are inadequate, revealing a deep discomfort with the possibility that meaning, imagination, and symbolic obligation were primary forces in shaping human history rather than byproducts of material success. The pillars still stand where they were set, staring outward with faceless permanence, not as answers, but as reminders that the first great human constructions may have been acts of belief, aimed not at mastering nature, but at negotiating existence itself, leaving behind a silence that continues to unsettle modern certainty about where civilization truly began. Çatalhöyük, rising from the Konya Plain as a low, unassuming mound rather than a skyline of stone. Çatalhöyük once functioned as a complete human world, a dense aggregation of lives pressed together so tightly that the boundary between house, memory and body dissolved, forming a settlement that assumed continuity not through monuments or walls, but through repetition, inheritance, and shared routines repeated across centuries. The intrigue of Çatalhöyük begins with its refusal to resemble what modern intuition expects from an early city. There are no streets, no palaces, no temples rising above others, no obvious hierarchy written into space. Yet, for more than 1,000 years, up to 8,000 people lived here simultaneously, coordinating daily life within an architectural logic that seems, at first glance, almost deliberately alien. Excavation reveals a honeycomb of mud brick houses built wall to wall, entered from the roof by ladders, with movement across the settlement taking place over rooftops rather than along ground-level paths, creating a lived environment that blurred private and public space and transformed the entire surface of the town into a shared plane of circulation. Inside these houses, the evidence grows more intimate and more unsettling. Floors plastered and replastered dozens of times, walls painted with scenes of hunting, abstract geometric patterns, and what may be one of the earliest known depictions of a settlement beneath a volcanic eruption, platforms used for sleeping and working, and beneath them, the dead. Human remains were carefully buried under living spaces, skulls sometimes removed, replastered and displayed, then reburied, embedding ancestry directly into domestic life so that the living quite literally slept above their past. Animal symbolism permeates the architecture, bull horns set into walls, leopard reliefs flanking platforms, bones incorporated into construction, suggesting a worldview in which human identity was inseparable from animal forces and cyclical regeneration. The labour required to maintain this environment was constant and communal, from sourcing clay and timber to rebuilding houses atop the remains of earlier ones, creating a vertical archive of lived experience that accumulated slowly rather than erupting into monumental form. For decades, the site challenged archaeological categories because it exhibited density without stratification, ritual without temples, and continuity without kings, forcing a reconsideration of how complex societies can function without centralized authority. Yet the contradiction at the heart of Çatalhöyük becomes clearer as the layers accumulate. Despite its apparent stability and longevity, the settlement shows subtle signs of stress, environmental pressure, and eventual dispersal that do not align with a single catastrophic event. Over time, houses became smaller, symbolic wall art less elaborate, resources more stretched, and the careful balance between people and landscape more precarious as farming intensified, and the surrounding environment was reshaped to sustain a growing population. There is no evidence of invasion or sudden collapse, no burned destruction layer or mass graves signalling violence, only a gradual thinning of occupation until the mound was finally abandoned, leaving behind a perfectly functional social model that nonetheless failed to perpetuate itself indefinitely. The contradiction lies in the fact that Çatalhöyük appears to have solved many of the problems that later societies struggled with. Inequality, urban alienation, centralized power, yet still proved impermanent, raising uncomfortable questions about whether sustainability is ever absolute or merely extended. Archaeologists have debated whether the very features that made Çatalhöyük resilient also limited its adaptability. Its tightly interwoven social fabric may have resisted innovation or large-scale reorganization, making incremental environmental and economic pressures increasingly difficult to absorb. Interpretations diverge sharply, with some viewing the settlement as a deliberately egalitarian experiment maintained through shared ritual and social norms, while others argue that hierarchy existed but was expressed subtly through access to symbolic spaces, burial treatment, or control over ritual knowledge rather than overt architecture. The long-running excavations led by Ian Hodder emphasized reflexive archaeology, acknowledging that modern assumptions about power, religion, and progress shape interpretation, and that Çatalhöyük may represent a social logic fundamentally different from later urban models rather than an incomplete version of them. More speculative theories suggest that the intense focus on interior life, houses as ritual centres, memory vaults, and symbolic landscapes may have made the settlement inward-looking, prioritising continuity with ancestors over engagement with broader regional networks that were emerging elsewhere. As neighbouring communities adopted new forms of social organisation, trade and specialisation, Çatalhöyük may have gradually lost its relevance, not because it failed, but because the world around it changed in ways that made its internal coherence less advantageous. What remains most striking is how fully human the site feels despite its age. Children grew up here, elders died here, meals were prepared, walls repainted, stories retold, and expectations quietly maintained that tomorrow would resemble today, closely enough to justify rebuilding yet another house atop the last. The final abandonment offers no moral lesson or dramatic warning, only absence, a reminder that even societies built on balance and shared meaning are not exempt from impermanence. Standing before the exposed ruins today, it becomes clear that Çatalhöyük's mystery does not lie in how advanced it was or why it ended, but in how calmly it demonstrates that complexity, equality, belief and loss are not sequential stages of progress, but overlapping conditions of human existence, leaving behind a silent mound that once held an entire world, and now asks without words how many such worlds have risen and faded without ever being named. Mount Nemrut, high in the Taurus Mountains, where wind strips language from thought and altitude, erodes all pretense of permanence. Mount Nemrut rises not as a natural peak alone, but as a deliberate interruption of the landscape. A mountain reshaped to preserve meaning, authority, and memory far beyond the lifespan of the people who built it, by those who assumed that stone elevation and cosmic alignment could outlast time itself. The intrigue of Mount Nemrut begins with scale deployed in isolation. Colossal seated figures, some over 9 meters tall when intact, positioned atop an artificial tumulus of crushed limestone, rising like a frozen explosion. Constructed not at the center of a thriving city, but at the edge of habitable geography, where survival itself is effort, and access is limited by snow, wind, and seasonal closure. This is not a monument meant to be stumbled upon, but one that demands intention, assent, and submission to exposure, implying that those who built it believed meaning intensified with distance from ordinary life. Archaeological evidence dates the complex to the 1st century BCE and links it to Antiochus I of Commagene, a minor king ruling a fragile buffer state between Roman and Parthian power, whose inscriptions describe in obsessive detail his divine lineage, his syncretic theology, and his instructions for eternal ritual maintenance, revealing a ruler acutely aware of impermanence and determined to outpace it through symbolism. The statues themselves embody this ambition. Composite gods merging Greek and Persian identities, Zeus Oromasdes, Apollo Mithras, Heracles Artagnes, seated beside the deified Antiochus, forming a pantheon designed to reconcile competing cultures under a single cosmological order, carved with precision and arranged to face celestial events, especially the rising and setting sun. Reliefs depict handshakes between king and gods, gestures frozen in stone meant to communicate equality, legitimacy, and eternal recognition, while long inscriptions prescribe festivals, sacrifices, and priestly duties to be carried out in perpetuity, assuming that future generations would not only remember but comply. The labour involved was immense. transporting massive blocks to a summit over 2,000 meters high, shaping them, assembling terraces, and creating the tumulus itself, which contains millions of stones piled deliberately to deter intrusion, suggesting an anxiety not just about death, but about violation, forgetting, and reinterpretation. Yet, embedded within this display of confidence lies a contradiction that becomes unavoidable as soon as the site is contextualized historically. Antiochus ruled for only a few decades. His kingdom was absorbed shortly after his death, and the elaborate ritual calendar he devised did not survive even a handful of generations, rendering Mount Nemrut almost immediately obsolete as a functioning religious center. The priests vanished, the sacrifices ceased, and the gods, carefully balanced between empires, lost their political relevance, leaving the statues exposed to centuries of freeze-thaw cycles, earthquakes and erosion that eventually severed their heads from their bodies, scattering faces across the terraces in an arrangement that appears deliberate but is entirely indifferent. The contradiction deepens when considering that the monument's purpose was not simply commemoration but continuity. Antiochus did not seek remembrance alone, but participation, envisioning a future in which his theology structured time itself through ritual repetition. Yet the very forces he tried to harmonize, empire, culture, belief, shifted too quickly for stone to anchor. Unlike cities that decline through economic or environmental processes, Mount Nemrut failed conceptually, its symbolic language becoming unintelligible as soon as the political context dissolved, turning its gods into relics rather than actors. Modern scholarship debates whether the tumulus conceals Antiochus's tomb at all, as no burial chamber has been conclusively found despite geophysical surveys, raising the possibility that the monument was more symbolic than sepulchral, a stage set for eternity that never required a body, or one deliberately concealed beyond recovery, reinforcing the theme of inaccessibility. Speculation surrounds the astronomical alignments of the terraces, with some researchers suggesting deliberate orientation to solstices or stellar configurations, while others caution that coincidence and selective interpretation may exaggerate precision. Yet, even skepticism cannot erase the intentional dialogue with the sky that the site enforces. More unconventional theories frame Mount Nemrut as an early experiment in manufactured mythology, a conscious attempt to fuse traditions into a new synthetic belief system tailored for political survival, revealing an awareness that legitimacy could be engineered as carefully as architecture. In this reading, Antiochus was not delusional, but pragmatic, using scale, isolation, and cosmology to compensate for geopolitical fragility, betting that gods carved in stone could stabilize borders that armies could not. What ultimately remains unresolved is not how Mount Nemrut was built or whom it represented, but why its creator believed so deeply that meaning could be frozen in form, immune to reinterpretation, decay, or neglect. Today, the fallen heads stare outward with eroded expressions that no longer command reverence or fear. Only reflection, as sunrise and sunset continue to perform the ritual Antiochus prescribed, attended not by priests, but by tourists and silence. The mountain still fulfills its astronomical function perfectly, indifferent to belief, reminding modern observers that while humans may construct eternity in stone, time requires no such effort. And the most enduring aspect of Mount Nemrut is not the king who named himself divine, but the unanswered question of whether any system of meaning, however elevated, can survive the moment its audience disappears. Hattusa. On a high plateau in central Anatolia, encircled by ridges that mute the horizon and winters that punish complacency, Hattusa once functioned as the nerve centre of an empire that assumed its laws, gods, and treaties would continue to regulate the world long after individual lives had passed. A city built not merely to house people, but to stabilise order itself through stone, ritual, and record. The intrigue of Hattusa arises from a dissonance that only becomes apparent after the scale is understood, because this was no marginal stronghold, but the capital of the Hittite Empire, a power that rivaled Egypt and Babylon, negotiated the earliest known international peace treaty, and governed vast territories. Yet today, it lies silent and exposed, its authority erased so completely that for centuries even its name was forgotten. Archaeological evidence reveals a city of extraordinary intentionality, massive cyclopean walls extending over 6 kilometers, punctuated by ceremonial gateways such as the Lion Gate and the King's Gate, each flanked by sculpted guardians meant to project permanence and intimidation. Carefully planned upper and lower cities, temples arranged by rank and deity, and an administrative core filled with archives rather than palaces, suggesting that control flowed through documentation as much as force. Tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets have been recovered, written in multiple languages, recording laws, rituals, diplomatic correspondence, and inventories, revealing a bureaucratic culture obsessed with precedent, classification, and continuity, a society that believed order could be preserved through replication and correct procedure. The religious landscape of Hattusa reinforces this logic, as the city housed hundreds of gods, each with prescribed rituals, reflecting a cosmology that prioritized inclusion and balance over exclusivity, and extended outward to sanctuaries like Yazilikaya, where processions of carved deities march eternally along rock walls, culminating in cosmic hierarchies rendered in stone, integrating kingship directly into divine order. The effort required to maintain such a system was immense, demanding agricultural surplus, trained scribes, ritual specialists, and constant rebuilding in a landscape prone to seismic activity and harsh climate. Yet for centuries it functioned, projecting the impression of a civilization that had solved the problem of governance through redundancy and tradition. The contradiction emerges precisely here, because despite this apparent robustness, Hattusa did not gradually decline or adapt into a successor state. It was abruptly abandoned around 1200 BCE, its population dispersing, its archives left behind, and its monumental core allowed to decay, an outcome that seems incompatible with a system so deeply invested in preservation. Unlike cities that fall to singular conquest, Hattusa's end aligns with the broader Bronze Age collapse, a period marked by systemic disruption across the eastern Mediterranean, yet the evidence at Hattusa resists simple explanation. There are signs of destruction in places, but not uniformly. Indications of famine and resource stress appear in texts, but not at levels that alone explain total abandonment. And while external pressure from migrating groups is often cited, the city's defences suggest it was built precisely to withstand such threats. The contradiction deepens when the written record is considered, because the Hittites documented everything, yet left no clear narrative of their own end, as if the mechanisms of collapse unfolded faster than the bureaucracy could process, record, and ritualize them. Even powerful kings like Suppiluliuma I, who expanded the empire to its zenith, appear in retrospect not as architects of lasting stability, but as accelerants of complexity, binding distant regions into a network that amplified vulnerability when communication, trade, or climate faltered. The more Hattusa is understood as a system, the more its disappearance resembles a failure of interdependence rather than of strength, a reminder that tightly coupled structures can unravel rapidly when multiple stresses converge. Speculation fills the silence left by this disappearance, with scholars proposing cascading causes: prolonged drought, reducing agricultural output, internal revolts destabilizing authority, disruptions in trade, severing access to critical resources like tin, and external pressures from groups later labelled as Sea Peoples, all interacting within a system optimized for continuity rather than resilience. Some interpretations suggest that Hattusa was deliberately evacuated, its administrative elite recognizing that the capital's symbolic weight made it a liability rather than an asset in a fragmented landscape, choosing mobility over monumentality in a world that no longer rewarded fixed centers of power. More unconventional theories emphasize cognitive collapse, arguing that the ritual and bureaucratic load required to sustain Hittite order became unsustainable under stress, leading not to rebellion but to disengagement, as people simply stopped performing the actions that made the system real. In this view, Hattusa did not fall so much as cease to be believed in, its gods unattended, its laws unenforced, its walls irrelevant without consensus. What remains most unsettling is how thoroughly the city vanished from memory. Unlike Troy or Babylon, Hattusa left no continuous legend, no living tradition to anchor its ruins, until modern archaeology reconstructed its identity from tablets buried in ash. Walking among its gates today, the scale still overwhelms. Yet the absence of narrative is palpable, as if the city exhausted its capacity to be remembered by investing too heavily in permanence. The open-ended mystery of Hattusa lies not in pinpointing a single cause of collapse, but in confronting the possibility that civilizations most confident in their systems may be least prepared for conditions that render those systems obsolete, leaving behind stone, records, and gods without practitioners, and a landscape that once coordinated an empire, now serving only as a quiet testament to how completely order can dissolve when the assumptions that sustain it quietly fail. Diyarbakır Walls. Along a bend of the Tigris River, where basalt erupts from the earth like a geological verdict, and the landscape itself seems to demand fortification, the Diyarbakır Walls once enclosed not merely a city but a promise that continuity could be enforced through stone, that memory could be disciplined into permanence, and that the future could be held at bay by sheer mass and repetition. The intrigue of the walls does not arise from mystery of origin, but from endurance, because unlike monuments built for singular rulers or moments, these fortifications were expanded, repaired, inscribed, and reinscribed for nearly 2 millennia, absorbing empires without collapsing into one, functioning as a living archive of power rather than its relic. Stretching over 5 kilometers and rising in places to 12 meters, constructed almost entirely of black basalt blocks, fitted with austere precision, the walls appear less like architecture than like a boundary condition imposed on history, a line beyond which chaos was meant to remain external. Archaeological and textual evidence reveals layers of authorship: Roman foundations, Byzantine reinforcements, Islamic restorations, Artukid towers, Ottoman repairs, each regime adding inscriptions, reliefs, symbols and proclamations directly onto the stone, not to erase predecessors, but to overwrite them visibly, asserting legitimacy through continuity rather than rupture. Reliefs of animals, astrological symbols, Quranic verses, imperial titles, and construction records coexist on the same surfaces, forming a palimpsest in which authority is measured not by novelty but by successful inheritance of the wall's function. The city within, modern Diyarbakir, operated for centuries under the assumption that the walls were not defensive structures alone but guarantors of order, defining civic identity as much as security, shaping movement, trade, and belonging. Towers punctuated the circuit at regular intervals, each with specific names and functions, transforming the wall into a modular system capable of adaptation rather than a static barrier, while gates regulated interaction with the outside world, controlling flow rather than preventing it outright. Unlike cities that grew beyond their walls and rendered them obsolete, Diyarbakir remained in dialogue with its fortifications, repairing breaches, adjusting sightlines, and incorporating new technologies without abandoning the underlying logic that the city was something to be contained and defended as a coherent whole. Yet the contradiction embedded in this endurance becomes apparent when continuity itself becomes the subject of scrutiny, because the walls succeeded in outlasting empires but failed to preserve any single meaning across time, becoming stable in form while fluid in purpose. Each inscription that claims eternal rule now reads as provisional, each emblem of dominion rendered equivalent by erosion, their declarations flattened into surface texture rather than authority. The walls did not prevent conquest, they merely slowed it, and in doing so they became witnesses rather than arbiters of history, absorbing violence, siege and transition without resolving them. More unsettling is the realization that the wall's greatest success, longevity, also contributed to their interpretive emptiness, as repetition dulled the urgency of meaning, transforming acts of defense into routines and inscriptions into habits rather than statements. As warfare evolved, artillery rendered massive walls increasingly symbolic, yet they continued to be repaired, not because they were strategically decisive, but because abandoning them would fracture the city's sense of itself. In this way, the walls reveal a contradiction between practical utility and psychological necessity, persisting less as military technology than as a shared agreement that the city required a visible edge to remain legible. Speculation surrounding the Diyarbakır Walls often focuses on their function as instruments of power. But a deeper ambiguity lies in their role as negotiators between inside and outside, safety and exposure, belonging and exclusion. Some scholars frame the walls as an early expression of urban sovereignty, a statement that governance begins at the boundary, while others emphasize their symbolic absorption of successive identities, arguing that the walls succeeded precisely because they never demanded ideological purity. More unconventional interpretations suggest that the walls functioned as a form of collective memory management, allowing regimes to claim legitimacy through inscription rather than transformation, reducing the need for violent rupture by offering stone as a neutral medium of succession. In this reading, the walls are not monuments to domination, but to compromise, enabling continuity by accepting contradiction rather than resolving it. Yet, even this adaptability has limits, and the modern era exposes a tension the walls were never designed to address: the erosion of boundaries not through siege, but through irrelevance. As cities expand, identities fragment, and governance shifts from physical control to abstract systems, the walls remain intact yet increasingly detached from the forces that once justified their existence. They are preserved, photographed, restored, and celebrated as heritage, but heritage itself is a form of distance, acknowledging value without dependence. The walls no longer define who is inside or outside. They define what is past. Walking their circuit today, one encounters not mystery in the sense of the unknown, but accumulation without resolution, a structure that contains centuries of certainty without delivering a conclusion. The open-ended enigma of the Diyarbakır Walls lies in their quiet challenge to the modern assumption that progress replaces rather than layers, because here power did not erase power, belief did not eliminate belief, and meaning did not arrive cleanly or leave decisively. Instead, it accreted, weathered and persisted, leaving behind a boundary that still stands long after the reasons for its construction have dissolved, asking whether permanence is achieved through dominance or through the willingness to be reused by those who no longer remember why it was first built. Çayönü. On a low rise above the Boğazçay stream in southeastern Anatolia, long before villages hardened into cities or belief hardened into doctrine, Çayönü existed as a lived experiment, a settlement where human beings were not yet certain what kind of world they were building, only that it needed to hold together long enough for memory, labour and expectation to begin compounding across generations. The intrigue of Çayönü lies in its quiet refusal to present a single identity, because it is neither a camp nor a city. neither fully mobile nor fully settled, but something transitional and unresolved, preserved at the precise moment when humanity began reorganizing itself around permanence without yet understanding the consequences of doing so. Archaeological layers reveal a sequence of architectural forms unlike anything before it. Round huts, giving way to rectangular buildings, then to carefully planned grill pattern foundations. Terrazzo floors made of crushed limestone polished smooth, and open courtyards that suggest communal coordination rather than individual enclosure. These are not random experiments, but iterative solutions, evidence of people learning, through trial, failure, and repetition, how to live in place rather than pass through it. The labour embedded in this transformation is substantial, requiring quarrying, transport, planning and maintenance, all without metal tools or beasts of burden, implying sustained cooperation among people whose subsistence strategies were still shifting between foraging and early cultivation. Çayönü is also where some of the earliest clear evidence of animal domestication appears, particularly pigs, marking a decisive reorientation of human-animal relationships from opportunistic hunting toward managed dependency, a shift that would reshape ecosystems, diets, and social hierarchies in ways no one living there could have foreseen. Yet the most arresting evidence lies not in the tools or floors, but in the treatment of bodies, especially within the structure known as the skull building, where human remains were deliberately deposited, rearranged and curated over time, suggesting rituals centered on death, ancestry and social memory that were spatially separated from daily domestic life. Skulls appear stacked, displayed, removed and returned, implying practices that treated the human head as a locus of identity or power long before written theology or formal priesthoods emerged. This integration of architecture, subsistence and mortuary behaviour suggests that Çayönü was not merely adapting to environmental opportunity, but actively constructing new social rules about ownership, belonging and obligation, embedding them into the ground itself. The contradiction becomes unavoidable as the evidence accumulates, because while Çayönü represents innovation on nearly every front, architecture, subsistence, social organisation, it also reveals signs of tension, stress, and eventual abandonment that do not align with simple narratives of progress. Skeletal remains show evidence of interpersonal violence, trauma, and differential treatment, hinting that increased proximity and permanence intensified conflict as much as cooperation. The very architectural regularity that implies planning may also indicate regulation, constraint, and emerging authority, raising the possibility that early social cohesion required enforcement rather than consensus alone. Environmental data suggests that intensified use of the surrounding landscape altered local ecologies, increasing pressure on resources and narrowing margins of sustainability, while the shift toward domestication introduced new vulnerabilities, binding survival to cycles of reproduction, disease, and climatic stability beyond immediate control. Despite its innovations, Çayönü did not grow indefinitely or transform seamlessly into later urban forms. Instead, it was eventually abandoned, its social experiment paused rather than completed, leaving behind foundations without descendants. This contradiction challenges the assumption that early complexity naturally evolves towards cities, suggesting instead that many pathways were attempted and discarded, not because they failed catastrophically, but because they produced consequences that were no longer acceptable to those living within them. Speculation surrounding Çayönü often centres on its role as a laboratory of early society, a place where architectural order and ritual authority were tested simultaneously, revealing how deeply intertwined belief and logistics were even at this early stage. Some scholars interpret the skull building as evidence of ancestor veneration, designed to legitimize claims to land and structure emerging inequality, while others emphasize its role in maintaining group cohesion during periods of stress, using the dead as anchors of continuity in a rapidly changing world. More unconventional interpretations propose that Çayönü represents an aborted trajectory of social evolution, one in which increasing regulation, ritualization and permanence provoked resistance or exhaustion, leading people to disperse rather than submit to emerging hierarchies. In this view, abandonment is not collapse, but choice, an assertion of mobility against the gravitational pull of settlement. What remains most unsettling is how much of what later defines civilization appears here in nascent form: planned space, managed food production, ritualized death, without any guarantee that these developments would lead to stability or satisfaction. The people of Çayönü were not building toward history as it would later be written. They were responding to immediate needs and opportunities, unaware that their experiments would echo across millennia. Today, the site offers no monumental skyline, no imposing walls, only low foundations and negative space. Yet within these absences lies a profound reminder that the most consequential human transformations often occur quietly, without spectacle or certainty. The open-ended mystery of Çayönü is not why it ended, but why it began at all, why human communities chose to anchor themselves to place, to manage life and death through architecture and ritual, and to accept the risks of permanence in exchange for continuity, leaving behind a settlement that does not announce the birth of civilization, but exposes the fragile, reversible decisions that made it possible. Derinkuyu. Beneath the soft volcanic plains of central Anatolia, in a landscape where the surface appears calm, agricultural, and almost indifferent, the underground city of Derinkuyu existed not as an anomaly, but as an accepted dimension of life, a parallel world carved downward by generations who assumed that safety, continuity, and survival were more reliably found in darkness than in daylight. The intrigue of Derinkuyu does not arise from its concealment alone, but from the realization that it was not a temporary refuge or singular response to crisis, but a fully articulated subterranean environment capable of sustaining thousands of people for extended periods, complete with ventilation shafts, water access, storage rooms, wine presses, chapels, schools, livestock stalls, and massive rolling stone doors designed to seal entire levels from intrusion. Archaeological evidence reveals a vertical city descending more than 60 meters, organized across at least 18 levels, with a ventilation system so precisely engineered that fresh air circulates even at the deepest chambers, a feat requiring sophisticated understanding of airflow, geology, and structural integrity, all achieved without modern tools or surveying instruments. The stone doors alone, circular slabs weighing hundreds of kilograms, fitted to be rolled into place from inside, signal not improvisation but anticipation, suggesting that the builders expected threat not as an exception but as a recurring condition of existence. Derinkuyu is part of a broader network of underground settlements throughout Cappadocia, some connected by tunnels stretching kilometers, implying regional coordination rather than isolated ingenuity, a shared agreement that life above ground could not always be trusted to endure. Historical layers complicate the picture further, as evidence suggests the site was expanded and reused across centuries, possibly originating in the early 1st millennium BCE, and later adapted by Byzantine Christians seeking refuge from persecution and invasion, each culture inheriting not only the physical space, but the logic that justified its existence. The contradiction embedded in Derinkuyu becomes apparent when its scale is fully grasped, because such an undertaking required immense collective labour, long-term planning and social cooperation, precisely the qualities associated with stable, surface-based societies. Yet it was constructed for the express purpose of withdrawal, concealment and disappearance. Why would a community invest so much effort into a city designed to be invisible? And what does it reveal about a worldview in which permanence is pursued, not through monuments, but through the ability to vanish? Unlike fortifications that project power outward, Derinkuyu internalizes defense, transforming fear into architecture and embedding anxiety into daily life, normalized through repetition and maintenance. The contradiction deepens when considering that underground living, while protective, is physiologically and psychologically taxing, lacking natural light, constraining movement, and compressing social space. Yet the evidence suggests that people did not merely endure these conditions briefly, but organized education, worship, and production within them, implying a cultural adaptation to concealment itself. There is no evidence of centralized authority imposing this design. Rather, the city appears modular, expandable, and flexible, shaped incrementally as needs evolved, which raises the possibility that Derinkuyu represents not authoritarian control, but collective consensus shaped by shared threat. Speculation about the nature of that threat has ranged widely, from conventional explanations involving invasions, raids, and religious persecution, to more speculative ideas invoking environmental catastrophe or long-term instability. Yet no single explanation fully accounts for the duration and sophistication of underground life. What is striking is how rarely written sources mention these cities, suggesting either that secrecy was essential to their function or that underground existence was so normalized that it required no explanation, a silent agreement between generations that survival did not require visibility. Some scholars emphasize the role of Christian communities during periods of Arab-Byzantine conflict, interpreting Derinkuyu as a refuge activated seasonally or during emergencies, while others argue that the depth and infrastructure exceed what would be necessary for short-term shelter, pointing instead toward prolonged occupation cycles that blurred the line between refuge and residence. More unconventional interpretations propose that underground living represented a philosophical stance as much as a practical one, a rejection of exposure, hierarchy, and spectacle in favor of inwardness, concealment, and resilience through obscurity. In this reading, Derinkuyu is not a city of fear, but of restraint, embodying a worldview in which survival is achieved by minimizing one's imprint on the surface world rather than dominating it. The absence of decoration, monumental art, or commemorative inscriptions reinforces this interpretation, as if the builders deliberately avoided symbols that might anchor identity too visibly in time or place. What remains unresolved is how people negotiated identity, belonging, and memory in a space designed to erase presence. How children learned what the world above looked like, and how communities decided when it was safe to emerge again. The archaeological record preserves tools, rooms, and passageways, but not the emotional calculus of deciding whether to stay hidden or return to light, whether danger had passed or merely changed form. Today, walking through Derinkuyu's narrow corridors, bent beneath low ceilings carved for bodies long accustomed to constraint, the experience is not claustrophobic so much as disorienting. A confrontation with a form of civilization built on the assumption that exposure is a liability. The open-ended mystery of Derinkuyu is not simply who built it or when, but what kind of future its builders imagined, a future in which survival depended not on expansion or visibility, but on the ability to retreat, adapt, and persist unseen, leaving behind a city that endures precisely because it was never meant to be found, challenging the modern belief that progress must rise upward, when for much of human history, endurance was achieved by going down.